Welcome. Tonight, we are going to walk the earth at the moment before everything familiar existed. No cities, no roads, no fire, just a vast, breathing wilderness that had never once heard a human voice. And somewhere inside that silence, a single creature stood upright, looked toward the horizon, and took a step. Tonight, we are going to follow that step. We are going to feel the rough grass under bare feet, smell the cold mineral air of a world untouched, and ask a question that has no clean answer. What was it actually like to be the very first of us? A world that had never heard us. 3 million years ago, the Earth was not waiting for us. That is the first thing to understand. It was not an empty stage, not a blank canvas, not a world holding its breath for something to arrive and give it meaning. It was full, completely, overwhelmingly, indifferently full. Of life, of sound, of systems so old and so intricately connected that our eventual arrival would barely register as a tremor. To understand where we came from, we have to stand inside that world first. We have to feel its weight before we can understand what it meant for something like us to appear inside it. So let us go there. Let us go to East Africa, 3 million years ago, at dusk. The light is going amber and flat across the grassland. The sky is enormous here, not the sky we know, interrupted by buildings and power lines and the distant glow of cities, but an unbroken dome of deepening orange and violet that touches the earth at every edge. Below it, the land stretches out in long, slow waves of grass, broken here and there by low acacia scrub and the dark, jagged silhouettes of distant rock outcroppings. Moving through that scrub, slowly, unhurried, is a herd of Civatherium. They are enormous creatures, ancient relatives of the giraffe, with wide branching horns and a heavy, deliberate way of moving through the dry grass. Their shadows stretch long and thin across the red earth. They are not afraid. There is nothing here yet that has learned to threaten them in any new way. The air smells of dry grass and distant rain. And underneath both of those, there is a faint mineral sharpness, the smell of volcanic rock, because this part of Africa is geologically restless. The ground beneath your feet is cracking, slowly, along a seam called the Rift Valley that runs for thousands of kilometers. Somewhere to the north, a low, dark plume of volcanic smoke rises against the amber sky. The earth is rearranging itself the way it has always done, without asking permission, and without noticing what lives on its surface. Now listen, because this is where it gets strange. The world is not quiet. There are insects, a dense, layered wall of sound that rises and falls with the cooling air. There are birds settling into the acacia trees with small, sharp calls. There is wind moving through the tall grass in long, slow waves, a sound like the breathing of something vast and patient. The Civatherium move with a low, rhythmic sound of heavy bodies pushing through dry vegetation. It is full of sound, and yet, underneath all of it, there is an absence so total that we would find it profoundly unsettling if we could hear it. No voice has ever called out a name in this landscape. No fire has ever been deliberately lit. No stone has ever been picked up with a plan in mind. Every sound this world makes is biological and mechanical and ancient. The sounds of appetite and wind and water and the slow groan of tectonic movement. But none of it is intentional. None of it is directed. None of it means anything to the thing making it. That specific kind of silence, the silence of a world without intention, is something we have never actually heard. We were born into a world already saturated with human meaning, and the world we are looking at right now has none of it, not a trace. And it has been this way for billions of years. This world has already survived things that should have ended it. The catastrophe that erased the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. Ice ages that buried entire continents under sheets of glacial ice kilometers thick. The slow, grinding drift of continents across the face of the planet, reshaping every coastline and mountain range across eons. Each time, life came back. Quieter sometimes, different always, but back. It is ancient and patient and completely indifferent. That is the only honest way to say it. And this specific world, this amber light, this mineral air, these slow-moving giants in the acacia scrub, this enormous and empty and lethal and beautiful savanna. This is the exact world our earliest ancestors were about to walk into. Not a world that had been waiting, a world that had been doing perfectly well without anything like us, and that would, at first, barely notice we were there. The ground was already there. The sky was already there. The rivers and the rock outcroppings and the water holes and the tall wind-moved grass were already there. And so were the predators. Large cats with long, curved teeth, enormous hyenas, crocodiles lying motionless in every slow-moving river, patient as stone. A food chain so well established and so finely balanced that adding a new creature to it would take hundreds of thousands of years of grinding, costly, often fatal trial and error. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you. It is always a quiet comfort to know who is out there, sitting in the dark, thinking about where we all came from. What makes this moment so worth sitting with, so worth letting settle in the dark, is the sheer improbability of what comes next. We were not inevitable. There was nothing about this world that required us or predicted us or made space for us in advance. We arrived into a system that had no use for us, no category for us, no particular reason to let us survive. And yet, something was about to change. Something small and slow and almost invisible, happening not out in the open grassland, but back in the thinning forests at the edge of the savannah, among creatures that still spent most of their lives in the trees. To understand what we became, we first have to understand what we were leaving behind. The high canopy, the safe branches, the life above the ground that our bodies were built for, and that the world was slowly, quietly, and irrevocably taking away from us, the trees we left behind. We were not always creatures of the open ground. That is something worth sitting with tonight, in the dark, before we go any further. For millions of years, before the first human took a single step across an open plain, our ancestors lived almost entirely above the earth, in the canopy, in the high branches, in the layered green, filtered world of the forest ceiling. Creatures like Ardipithecus, among the earliest of our hominin relatives, moved through the trees the way we now move through streets. The branches were their roads. The canopy was their neighborhood. They read the world from above, the movement of predators below, the location of fruit, the safest routes between feeding grounds. And they slept in the high places where the big cats could not easily follow. It was a life of extraordinary sensory richness, enclosed and sheltered and defined by bark and leaf, and the specific filtered quality of light coming through a dense forest ceiling. And then, slowly, that world began to disappear. Around 6 million years ago, the Earth started to cool. The process was geological in its pace, not something any individual creature could perceive across a lifetime, or even across 1,000 lifetimes. But across hundreds of thousands of years, the forests of East Africa began to contract. The canopy thinned. The spaces between the trees grew wider and wider, and those spaces filled not with more forest, but with something new and open and deeply dangerous. Grass. This is the thing to understand about that transition. It was not a choice. It was not a moment of courage or exploration. The forest was simply becoming less forest, year by year, generation by generation, until the creatures that depended on it found themselves standing at the edge of something they had no framework for. Open ground, open sky, exposure, and out there in that grass, things were waiting, things that were very good at catching creatures that crossed open ground. So coming down from the trees was not a triumph, not even close. It was a slow, reluctant, costly adaptation to a world that had become less hospitable to the life that had existed before. Every step away from the forest edge was a step into a more lethal environment, with less cover, less familiarity, and predators that the body had never been built to outrun. Imagine the texture of that transition, the rough, familiar bark of the last tree at the forest edge, the kind of surface a body had always known. And then the ground, harder than expected, less predictable than branches, full of small irregularities that bark and branch had never asked the feet to handle. And above, no canopy, just open sky, enormous and indifferent, offering nothing between you and whatever was watching from the grass. Early hominins, like Australopithecus, were already beginning to experiment with walking upright on two legs by around 4 million years ago. But their bodies had not caught up with the experiment. They still had long arms built for climbing, curved fingers that remembered the shape of branches, proportions that belonged to a creature that spent most of its life above the ground. They were, in the most literal sense, halfway between two different ways of existing. Not fully arboreal anymore, but not yet built for the ground either. Upright walking was slow. It was energetically expensive in ways that moving through the trees had not been. The spine, the knees, the hips, none of them were fully suited to this new demand. They were carrying the biomechanical memory of a different life, and that memory made every step on open ground a small act of compromise between what the body was and what the world was now requiring it to be. But something happened as a result of standing upright that no creature had experienced before on this planet. The hands came free. That sounds almost too simple, but the consequence of it is almost impossible to overstate. For every animal that moves on four limbs, the forelimbs are committed to locomotion. They carry weight, they push against the ground, they are not available for anything else. But a creature moving on two legs, even slowly, even painfully, even imperfectly, has two limbs that are no longer needed for moving. And those limbs, those hands, suddenly become available for everything else. Carrying food, carrying infants, picking things up, putting things down somewhere specific. Eventually, much later, picking up a rock with a plan in mind. It is one of the most consequential accidents in the history of life on this planet. And it did not happen because anyone intended it. It happened because the forest shrank and the ground was there and the body adapted to survive what the world had become. None of this was clean or fast or triumphant. It was a grinding, generation by generation process of a body slowly, imperfectly, painfully, learning to do something it had not been built for, in an environment that was actively dangerous, surrounded by predators that were far better suited to open ground than we were. The resolution here is not a victory. It is a quiet, difficult persistence, a species caught between two worlds, carrying the physical memory of one while being forced by geology and climate and simple survival to learn the other. And while all of this was happening, while the body was learning the ground, while the hands were coming free, while the spine and the knees and the hips were slowly, painfully reorganizing themselves around a new way of moving, something else was happening too. Something that would eventually change everything far more profoundly than bipedalism alone ever could. Inside that adapting skull, processing all of this new information, The open ground, the exposed sky, the unfamiliar predators, the constant, lethal novelty of a world without a canopy overhead. The brain was beginning to change. The first face, at some point in that long, slow process of coming down from the trees and learning the ground, something crossed a line. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but the line was crossed, and what came out the other side was something we would recognize, if we could see it today, as belonging to us. Not just a primate, something closer, something that looked back. The genus Homo appears in the fossil record somewhere between 2.8 and 3 million years ago, in East Africa. The earliest candidate we have a name for is Homo habilis, small, maybe 1.5 meters tall, lighter than most of us, with a brain still only about half the size of the one you are using right now to listen to this. But the skull was different. The face was flatter than what came before. The brain case was beginning to expand in a way that suggested something new was happening inside, something the bone itself was struggling to contain. Here is the quiet strangeness of this moment, though. We cannot draw a clean line. There is no single fossil in any museum on Earth that is definitively, unambiguously, the first human. The transition from Australopithecus to Homo was gradual and overlapping and messy in the way that all real evolutionary transitions are messy. These creatures existed alongside each other for hundreds of thousands of years, different forms, different sizes, sharing the same savanna, drinking from the same waterholes, probably aware of each other in the careful, watchful way that similar creatures are always aware of each other. Evolution does not send an announcement, it just keeps moving. But something about Homo was different in a way that mattered beyond brain size. The brain was not just growing, it was reorganizing. The regions associated with planning, with reading other minds, with the ability to hold a future action in your head while doing a present one. Those specific regions were expanding. That is not a small thing. That is the difference between reacting to the world and beginning, in the most primitive and tentative way, to model it. Picture what that face might have looked like. Less jaw than the earlier primates, less of that heavy, forward-jutting bone that makes the older hominins look so different from us. The eyes sat a little more forward in the skull, which gave better depth perception, which matters enormously when you are moving through complex terrain and need to judge distances quickly and accurately. The brow was still heavy, still casting a shadow over the eyes, still very much the face of a creature shaped by a dangerous world. But underneath that brow, something looked back at the world with a quality that is hard to name precisely. Attention, maybe, or something like recognition, the sense that the world was being perceived, not just reacted to. These early humans almost certainly lived in small groups, probably somewhere between 15 and 30 individuals, because that is the number that makes ecological sense for a creature of their size and their caloric needs on the East African savanna. Small enough to move efficiently and find enough food, large enough to offer some protection, some collective awareness, some distribution of the endless, exhausting work of staying alive. They communicated, not with language the way we use it, not with grammar and syntax, and the layered complexity of words that carry history inside them, but with sound and gesture and the deep, finely tuned social intelligence that comes from living in close physical proximity to other minds you depend on completely. They knew each other. They read each other. The survival of every individual in the group depended on the group, and that dependency created a kind of attention to other minds that was, in its own way, entirely new. The world they moved through was genuinely, specifically, lethally dangerous. Dinophilis was out there, a large, heavy-bodied, saber-toothed cat that researchers believe was almost certainly a specialized predator of early hominins. Not just an opportunistic threat, but a creature that had evolved, at least in part, around the specific vulnerability of these small, upright, ground-dwelling primates. They were giant hyenas whose jaws could crack bone the way we crack a knuckle. There were crocodiles in every river crossing, motionless and patient in the slow brown water, indistinguishable from floating logs until they were not. Every single day in that world contained multiple situations that required a choice between two different kinds of fear: the fear of going to the waterhole and the fear of not going. The fear of crossing the open ground and the fear of staying still and starving. Fear was not an emotion to be managed. It was a navigational tool, and learning to use it correctly was the difference between living and not. And yet, they were here, moving through that world, reading it, learning it, surviving inside it. Not because they were the strongest animals on the savannah, because they absolutely were not. And not because they were the fastest, because they were not that either. But because something in that expanding, reorganizing brain was beginning to model the world in a way that no creature had quite managed before. Beginning to see patterns, beginning to anticipate, beginning to hold a picture of the world as it was and compare it, however dimly, to a picture of the world as it might become. That is what was different, not the size, the structure, the slow, costly, extraordinary reorganization of a brain learning to think about the future. Picture one of them now, standing at the edge of a waterhole at dusk. The light is low and orange. The water is still. Somewhere in the grass to the west, something is moving. A sound, a displacement of air, a subtle wrongness that the body registers before the mind can name it. And this creature stands there, completely still, ears open, eyes forward, reading the world with everything it has. What it felt like to be inside that mind, in that moment, is something we will never fully know. The weight of a stone. We think of the first tool as a moment of genius, a flash of insight. One creature, smarter than the rest, picking up a rock and suddenly understanding something that no living thing had understood before. But that is not what the evidence tells us. The evidence tells us something quieter than that, and in some ways more moving. The oldest stone tools we have found date to around 3.3 million years ago. They were discovered at a site called Lomakwi 3 in Kenya, buried in sediment that had been undisturbed for longer than the human mind can comfortably hold. And here is the thing that stops you when you first encounter it. 3.3 million years ago may predate the genus Homo entirely, which means the act of deliberately shaping stone may have begun not with humans as we define them, but with our pre-human ancestors. Creatures we've already met in this journey, still carrying the memory of the trees in their curved fingers and long arms. These tools are not impressive to look at. That is worth saying plainly. If you held one in your hand tonight, you would probably mistake it for an ordinary rock. It is just a stone, cracked in a specific way to produce a sharp edge along one side. No symmetry, no elegance, nothing that announces itself as the beginning of something enormous. But making it required something profound, something that had never happened on this planet before. To chip a stone intentionally, you have to hold a mental image of the shape you want before it exists in the world. You have to look at a round, smooth river cobble and see not what it is, but what it could become. That gap between what a thing is and what it could become is not a small cognitive step. That is the beginning of a relationship with the future. And before this moment, no creature on Earth had that relationship. The process itself was physical and demanding and very specific. You would take a round river cobble in one hand, smooth, cold, dense, heavier than it looks, and you would strike it at a precise angle with another stone, what toolmakers call a hammer stone. The angle had to be right. Too shallow, and nothing happened. The hammer stone just glanced off and left a small, useless scar. Too deep, and the whole cobble shattered into fragments you couldn't use. But the right angle, applied with the right force to the right part of the stone, produced something extraordinary. A thin, curved flake with an edge sharper than most kitchen knives you have used today. Feel that for a moment. The cold weight of the cobble in your palm, the jarring shock of the strike traveling up through the wrist and into the forearm, and the smell, because freshly struck flint has a smell, a clean, sharp, almost electrical smell, like the air just after lightning. Ancient toolmakers would have known that smell as well as we know the smell of coffee in the morning. It would have meant something specific to them. It would have meant that the strike had landed right. These flakes were used for butchering, scraping meat from bone, mostly, and cracking bone open to reach the marrow inside, which is where the real nutritional prize was hidden. Marrow is extraordinarily calorie-dense, richer gram for gram than almost any other food source available on the savannah, and accessing it, which no other creature without a tool could do efficiently, gave early hominins a nutritional edge that researchers believe may have directly fueled the brain expansion we talked about earlier in our journey tonight. There is a feedback loop here that is almost elegant in how simple it is. Better tools meant better access to calories. Better calories meant a body that could afford to grow and maintain a larger, more complex brain. And a larger, more complex brain meant the capacity to make better tools. Each revolution of that loop, across thousands of generations, pushed both the technology and the biology forward in ways that neither could have achieved alone. The sites where these tools are found are not scattered randomly across the landscape. They cluster near water sources, rivers, lake shores, the muddy margins of ancient waterholes. These were the places where large animals came to drink, and where predators hunted them, and where, after the predators had eaten and moved on, carcasses were left behind. And this tells us something important about who these early toolmakers actually were in the food chain. They were not hunters, not yet. They were scavengers, moving carefully, quickly, and quietly toward kill sites after the lions had gone, using their sharp-edged stones to take what remained before the hyenas arrived. It required its own kind of intelligence, reading the landscape, timing the approach, working fast under pressure, knowing when to leave. Picture that scene in the grey light of an early African morning. A small group of hominins, maybe 8 or 10 of them, moving low and fast across open ground toward the dark shape of a carcass near the waterline. The air is cold and still. The smell of blood and opened gut is heavy and specific. Somewhere behind them, maybe half a kilometer away, a group of hyenas is already moving in the same direction, drawn by the same smell. And these small, upright creatures work with their stones, scraping, striking, cracking, taking meat, taking marrow, filling their hands with calories that will keep the group alive for another day. It is not heroic. It is desperate and practical, and completely, recognizably human in its urgency. And those stones, those simple, ugly, almost accidental-looking flakes of rock lying in the mud of a Kenyan lakebed 3 million years later, those were the first physical objects that any creature on this planet had ever made, with a plan already formed in its mind. Not found, not borrowed from the world as it was, made, shaped by intention, toward a future that existed for one brief and extraordinary moment, only inside a single, ancient, hungry mind. Reading the land, there is a skill that early humans carried with them through every waking hour of their lives, a skill so fundamental to their survival that losing it, even for a single day, could mean death. It was the ability to read the land. Not maps, not written language. The land itself, the grass, the mud, the sky, the wind, as a living, continuous text that told you exactly where you were, what was near you, and whether you were going to survive the next hour. We have almost entirely lost this, and we have lost it so completely that we barely notice it is gone. Early humans moving through the East African savanna were surrounded by information at every moment. The world was talking constantly in a language made of physical things. Vultures circling in a slow, patient gyre 3 kilometers to the east meant something had died there, and that something might still have meat on it. A herd of antelope suddenly lifting their heads in unison and turning to face the same direction meant a predator was moving upwind of them, probably within a few hundred meters. The color of the water in a stream, whether it ran clear or carried a faint reddish silt, told you what the ground upstream looked like and whether the banks up there were the kind of place a crocodile would rest. Every signal had a meaning. Every deviation from the ordinary was a sentence worth reading carefully. But here is the thing that separates us from almost every other animal on the savannah. None of this knowledge was instinctual. A wildebeest is born with deep, wired-in responses to the smell of a predator. A gazelle does not have to learn to run, but a human infant arrives in the world knowing almost nothing about how to survive inside it. Every single piece of ecological knowledge, every signal, every pattern, every dangerous exception to the usual, had to be learned, observed, remembered, and then, critically, passed on. This means that early human groups were, in a very real sense, living libraries. The knowledge that kept the group alive was not stored in stone or clay or any physical object. It was stored in people, in the memory of the oldest woman in the group who remembered where the water source to the north held through the last long drought, in the experience of the man who had once walked too close to a particular rock outcropping at dusk and had heard, just in time, the low, specific cough of a leopard settling in for the night. That knowledge was irreplaceable. Lose the person and you lose what they knew. There was no archive, there was no backup. So picture moving through the tall grass of the Rift Valley in the early morning. The dew is still cold on the stems, soaking into the skin where the grass presses close. The air carries something faint and sweet and slightly wrong, the distant smell of a carcass, maybe a day old, somewhere to the northwest. And the ground is soft enough to hold tracks, deep, round impressions left by elephant feet moving through in the dark hours before dawn, each one wide enough to hold both your hands flat inside it. You are reading all of this simultaneously, without effort, because you have been reading it since the first day you were old enough to follow the group out of the sleeping place and onto the open ground. Early humans were not just tracking animals. They were tracking the whole system, the pattern of the wet season arriving, the specific quality of the light in the afternoons, the particular smell in the air before the first rains, the behavior of certain birds that seemed to know before anything else that the water was coming, the locations of water sources that persisted through drought, which were not obvious and not common and not to be forgotten under any circumstances, the territories of specific predator groups, because a lion pride has a range, and knowing the edges of that range was the difference between a safe path and an extremely dangerous one. Researchers call this cumulative culture, the ability to build knowledge across generations, each one inheriting what the last one learned, and adding to it and passing the improved version forward. It is one of the things that most clearly separates early humans from the other primates sharing the savannah with them. A chimpanzee can watch another chimpanzee crack a nut with a stone and learn to do the same thing. That is genuinely impressive, but it cannot easily refine the technique, teach the refinement deliberately, and ensure the improved version survives into the next generation. Early humans, even without language as we understand it, seem to have been doing exactly that. Slowly, generation by generation, building a richer and more detailed map of the world they moved through. The landscape itself was the curriculum. A river that flooded predictably every year at the same time was a lesson in seasonal rhythm. A specific rock outcropping where the right kind of flint could always be found was a lesson in geology and resource management. The migration routes of the great herds, those long, slow, seasonal rivers of animal movement across the savannah, were a lesson in abundance and timing and the patience required to be in the right place when the opportunity arrived. The classroom was the open ground. The teachers were the oldest people in the group, and the stakes of failing to pay attention were absolute. There is something deeply settling about this image if you let it rest for a moment. A small group of people, maybe 20 of them, moving slowly and quietly through a vast, ancient, lethal landscape, paying attention to everything, reading the bent grass and the circling birds and the cold morning air, with a quality of attention we have almost no modern equivalent for. Wasting nothing, missing, carrying in their minds a living map of the world that had taken generations to build. They were learning the earth the way you learn the face of someone you love, detail by detail, slowly and with everything at stake. The long dark we do not think about the night, not really. We move through the dark hours of our modern lives, wrapped in so many layers of artificial light, the glow of a screen, the orange wash of a street lamp through a curtain, the distant brightness of a city on the horizon, that the actual physical darkness of the world has become almost theoretical to us. Something we know exists in principle, but rarely encounter in its true form. But for the earliest humans moving through the East African savannah, the night was not a background condition. It was a specific, recurring, and deeply lethal event that arrived every single day without exception, and that shaped almost every decision about how and where and with whom they lived. Before fire was controlled, and the evidence for sustained, deliberate fire use only solidifies around 400,000 years ago, night was something else entirely. The darkness was absolute. No ambient glow from distant settlements, no moon on many nights, just a black sky dense with stars that gave light enough to see shapes, but not enough to see what those shapes were doing. And into that darkness, the savannah did not go quiet. It went active. The big cats of the Pliocene and early Pleistocene were built for exactly this. Dinofelis and Meganterian, and later the leopard and the lion. These were animals whose eyes gathered light in conditions that left early humans effectively blind. They hunted most effectively in the low, flat darkness after sunset, and early humans, with their relatively weak night vision, were at their most exposed and most vulnerable during exactly those hours. The darkness was not neutral territory. It belonged to the predators. Imagine that darkness now. Not the comfortable dark of a room with the lights off, where you know the walls are close and the floor is level and the sounds you hear are familiar. This was the darkness of open ground, of terrain that shifted and changed, of sounds arriving from no clearly identifiable direction, a movement in the tall grass that could be wind, or could be something low and heavy and patient, moving slowly toward you through the stems. The reason this darkness was so profoundly threatening is simple, and it is absolute. You could not read it. Every skill that kept early humans alive during daylight hours, the ability to track, to read body language, to spot a predator at distance, was stripped away the moment the sun went below the horizon. The cumulative, hard-won knowledge of the landscape became almost useless in the dark, and the predators knew it. Early humans almost certainly slept in trees when trees were available, or on elevated rocky outcroppings, positions that reduced the number of angles from which something could approach without being heard first. High ground was survival ground, and the group slept close together, bodies pressed against bodies, sharing warmth against the cold that dropped fast and hard after sunset on the open savanna. More ears meant more warning, more bodies meant more collective heat, and a slightly smaller margin of vulnerability at every edge of the sleeping cluster. The sounds of that night were extraordinary and relentless. The coughing grunt of a leopard somewhere to the east, that short, repetitive, soaring sound that carries across enormous distances in the still night air, and that your nervous system responds to before your thinking mind has time to process it. The distant, rising whoop of hyenas, a sound that starts low and climbs into something almost human, which makes it worse, somehow, not better. And underneath both of those, occasional and immense, the subsonic rumble of elephants moving through the darkness, a sound so low in frequency that you feel it in your chest and your sternum more than you hear it with your ears, a vibration that tells you something very large is close, even when you cannot see anything at all. And underneath all of that, the predators, the insects, the wind in the grass, the geological creak and settle of the cooling earth, there was the breathing of the people around you, small, warm, specific sounds, the particular rhythm of someone you had known since birth, the small shift and rustle of a person turning in their sleep. These sounds were not just comforting in an abstract way. They were information. They told you the group was intact, that nothing had entered the sleeping place, that the night, so far, had not taken anyone. That breathing was the closest thing to safety the darkness offered. This is the night that built us. The long, cold, predator-filled dark pressed itself into our biology across hundreds of thousands of generations, and it is still there. The reason human sleep is lighter and more fragmented than the sleep of many other primates, shorter cycles, more frequent, partial waking, is almost certainly a direct result of the pressure those nights applied to our ancestors. A creature that slept too deeply did not always wake up. So we evolved to sleep lightly, to surface toward waking in the small hours, to respond instantly and fully to any sound that does not belong. The fear of the dark that many of us still carry is not irrational. It was never irrational. It is ancient and earned and written into us far below the level of conscious thought. Written in the same slow, patient hand that wrote our curved fingers and our forward-facing eyes and our tendency to move in groups. It is a memory the body kept even when the mind forgot why. Every time a strange sound in the night pulls you instantly out of sleep, heart already moving, senses already sharp, before you have consciously identified what you heard, that is not anxiety. That is 3 million years of earned intelligence, still doing its job, still scanning the dark the way it learned to scan it on the open ground of a world that was genuinely, specifically, and lethally dangerous after the sun went down. The night shaped us completely, and for hundreds of thousands of years, there was nothing we could do about it, except survive it, together, one dark at a time. The first fire. Fire did not arrive as a discovery, it arrived as a recognition. And there is a difference between those two things that is worth sitting with tonight, in the dark, before we go any further. A discovery is finding something that was hidden. A recognition is seeing something familiar in a completely new way. And that is what fire was. Something our ancestors had always known, always feared, always moved away from when lightning cracked it into existence across the dry grass of the savannah. They knew fire. They had known it for millions of years. What changed, slowly and across many generations, was that they stopped running from it and started moving toward it instead. The evidence for exactly when this shift happened is layered and contested and genuinely difficult to read. There are burnt bones and ash deposits at Wonderwork Cave in South Africa that date to around 1 million years ago. Ancient traces of heat and carbon pressed into the earth and waiting there, patient and dark, for us to find them. There are hearth-like structures at a site called Geisha Benot Yaakov in Israel from around 790,000 years ago. Arrangements of burned material that suggest something more deliberate than an accidental brush with a passing wildfire. But the consistent, sustained practice of tending fire, feeding it, managing it, carrying it from one place to the next, seems to have settled into regular human behavior somewhere around 400,000 years ago. But here is the thing about fire that we almost never stop to consider. It is alive in a way that no other tool ever was or ever could be. A stone scraper does not need you. You can put it down and walk away and come back a year later and it will be exactly as you left it, unchanged, patient, waiting. Fire is nothing like that. Fire moves. It breathes. It consumes everything it touches and grows larger doing it. It dies the moment you stop paying attention to it. Tending a fire is not a task. It is a relationship. It makes demands. It requires presence and attention, and a kind of ongoing responsibility that no previous tool had ever asked of the people who used it. Think about what that means. The first humans to deliberately tend a flame were entering into a relationship with a natural force that had previously been the enemy. Something that destroyed, that spread, that had no interest in the small, upright creatures trying to survive on the open ground. And they were making it domestic, bringing it inside the circle of the group, making it theirs. What fire gave them first was warmth and light. And in the context of everything we have already moved through tonight, you understand exactly what that meant. The cold that dropped hard and fast after sunset on the open savannah, held back now by something small and orange and alive at the center of the group. The darkness that belonged to the predators pushed back to the edges of a circle of flickering light. A leopard will approach a fire with extreme caution. A lion will circle it, watching from the dark, but hesitate to cross into the light. The flame did not make early humans safe, but it moved the boundary between safe and lethal in a direction that had never moved before. And then there was cooking. Applying heat to food changes it at a chemical level. It breaks down the tough fibers in meat and plant material. It kills pathogens. It makes the calories inside it dramatically easier for the body to extract. A cooked meal delivers more usable energy than the same raw ingredients, which means that the brain, that costly, hungry, growing brain that demanded so much of the body's resources, could be fed more efficiently. The feedback loop we have been following all night turned again. Fire fed the brain that had learned to tend the fire. But fire gave something else that is harder to measure, and perhaps more important than any of the practical benefits. It gave a center. Before the hearth, the group moved constantly through the dark hours, driven by the need to avoid staying in one place long enough for a predator to plan around them. The fire changed that. It gave them a reason to stay, a place to return to. And in staying, in gathering around that small, warm, demanding flame with the darkness pressing in, from every side, something new began to happen in the space between the people sitting there. Faces were visible to each other in a way they had never been in the dark hours before. Expressions could be read, small sounds could be made without immediately signaling a location to something dangerous. The group could be together, fully present, still, and not just enduring the night, but actually occupying it, filling it with something that had not existed in it before. Some researchers believe that those hours around the fire, the long social stretch between dusk and sleep, may have been a critical space for the early development of language, of storytelling, of the transmission of knowledge, in ways that went far beyond simple observation and imitation. The hearth was the first home, not a structure, not a shelter, but a place, a specific, chosen, tended place that the group organized itself around. And that, quietly and without announcement, was something entirely new on this planet. Fire was not an invention in the way we usually use that word. It was not a eureka moment. It was a slow, desperate, generation by generation act of survival that accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years into the foundation of almost everything we would eventually call civilization. Every forge, every furnace, every kitchen, every power plant running tonight traces itself back to a small, carefully tended flame on the open ground of an ancient African night. And on those first nights, sitting close to that first sustained fire, with the dark held just barely at bay, our ancestors were doing something no living thing had ever done in the 4 billion year history of life on this planet. They were choosing deliberately and at great cost not to be consumed by the thing that had always consumed everything it touched. They were choosing to stay, crossing the horizon for a very long time. The Rift Valley was enough. The waterholes, the grasslands, the acacia scrub, the specific quality of the light at dusk across the red earth. This was the world our ancestors knew, and they knew it completely, in the deep, detailed way that only comes from generations of living and dying inside the same landscape. The horizon was a boundary, a hard edge at the end of the known world, beyond which nothing useful had ever been confirmed to exist. And then something shifted. The horizon became a question. Homo erectus was different from the humans who came before in ways that mattered immediately and practically. Taller, longer legs, built not for short bursts of speed, but for covering ground efficiently across long distances. The kind of legs that could walk all day without breaking down. A brain significantly larger than Homo habilis, housed in a skull that was flatter on top and broader at the sides. This was a creature built, almost as if deliberately, for movement across open terrain. And around 1.8 million years ago, that is exactly what it did. The dispersal of Homo erectus out of Africa is one of the most extraordinary movements in the history of life on this planet. By 1.8 million years ago, populations had reached the Caucasus, the mountainous region where Europe and Asia pressed together, and from there, across the vast, slow centuries, they moved further. Into South Asia, into Southeast Asia, across landscapes of temperate woodland and dense tropical forest, and open, wind-scoured steppe, none of which looked anything like the African savanna, where the journey had begun. We do not know what drove them. That is the honest answer, and it is worth sitting with rather than talking around. It may have been population pressure, too many individuals competing for the same patches of resource in the same familiar territory, the ecological tension building slowly until some groups simply moved rather than stayed and competed. It may have been the migrations of prey animals, the great herds shifting their seasonal routes in response to a changing climate, and the humans following because the food went where the food went. Or it may have been something quieter and harder to measure, the same pull toward an unknown horizon that has appeared again and again in every chapter of the human story we have told tonight. Picture the moment of crossing into genuinely new territory, not just unfamiliar ground, but a world where everything the group knew was suddenly, specifically, less useful. The trees are wrong. Different shapes, different bark, different fruiting cycles, different things living inside them. The birds are unknown. The predators are unknown, which is perhaps the most unsettling and profound part of all. Because a predator you cannot read is a predator you cannot anticipate. Every piece of ecological knowledge that the group carried, that living library of accumulated survival intelligence built across generations, was now partially obsolete, not worthless, but incomplete in ways that could kill you before you had time to fill in the gaps. They had to rebuild their understanding of the world from the ground up, in real time, while also finding water, finding food, finding shelter, and navigating threats from animals that had never encountered humans before, and therefore had no particular reason to be cautious of them. This is where the Acheulean hand axe becomes something more than just a stone tool. Homo erectus made these teardrop-shaped, symmetrical, carefully worked on both faces, requiring a level of planning and spatial reasoning that the earlier, older one flake tools simply did not demand. To make a hand axe, you have to hold the finished shape in your mind before you begin, and then remove material systematically, strike by strike, always working toward that imagined form. It is not just skill. It is sustained mental modeling of an object that does not yet exist. And here is what makes these tools extraordinary beyond their construction. They are found across thousands of kilometers of the ancient world, in Africa, in the Caucasus, in South Asia, in a form so consistent, so recognizably similar across such vast distances and across hundreds of thousands of years, that the only explanation is a transmission of design so faithful and so durable that it crosses generations and continents without losing its essential shape. The hand axe was not reinvented in each new place. It was carried, not always physically, but in the hands and the minds of the people who moved. That is knowledge traveling across the face of the earth in the most direct way possible, inside people, passed from one pair of hands to another, generation after generation, through demonstration and imitation, and the patient repetition of a skill until it was held securely enough to be passed on again. Each new landscape was a chapter being written in real time by people who had no way of knowing how far the story would go, or whether it would continue at all. Every river crossing was a risk. Every mountain range was a barrier that had to be read and understood, and eventually crossed, or lived against, or moved around. The world was not cooperating. It was simply there, vast and indifferent, and full of challenges that had no interest in whether the small, upright creatures trying to cross it survived the attempt. And the earth itself was not staying still. This is the thing to hold in mind as we follow these ancient migrations. The planet was cycling through ice ages with a slow, grinding rhythm. Glaciers advancing down from the poles and retreating again over tens of thousands of years. Sea levels dropping as water locked into ice and rising again as it melted. Land bridges between continents appeared and disappeared. Coastlines shifted. Entire landscapes that Homo erectus populations had learned and mapped and built their survival knowledge around were reorganized by forces so large and so slow that no individual life could perceive them. The world kept changing the rules, and the humans kept adapting to whatever the rules had most recently become, carrying their tools and their knowledge and their social bonds forward into each new version of a planet that was never quite finished rearranging itself. Ice, desert, and the edges of the world, every landscape early humans entered was, in some sense, a test. And the further they moved from the warm, resource-rich environments where they had first evolved, the harder the tests became. By the time Homo sapiens, our own species, appeared around 300,000 years ago in Africa, the planet was cycling through ice ages with a slow, grinding rhythm that reshaped entire continents. Glaciers advanced down from the poles and retreated again. Deserts expanded across landscapes that had recently been grassland, then contracted again when the rains returned. The world that early humans were trying to learn was a world that kept revising itself, kept pulling the ground from under the knowledge they had so carefully built. Surviving this required something beyond physical strength or speed. It required behavioral flexibility, the ability to abandon a strategy that had stopped working, invent a new one under pressure, and hold on to knowledge about conditions that might not return for 1,000 years, but that, when they did, would matter enormously. A drought that emptied a particular valley of every water source. A cold snap that pushed entire herds of animals south in a single season. These were not abstract challenges. They were immediate, lethal, and unforgiving. Consider what it meant to survive a glacial advance in northern Europe. The cold arrived not as a single catastrophic event, but as a slow, patient thief. Temperatures dropping degree by degree across decades. The growing season shortening. The plant foods disappearing, first under early frosts, and then under permanent ice and snow. The prey animals that had sustained a group through the warmer seasons migrated south, following the retreating grass. And the humans who had built their entire survival knowledge around a specific landscape watched that landscape become something they no longer recognized. The ones who survived were not the strongest. They were the most organized. They planned the furthest ahead. The archaeological record from these cold climate sites is, in its quiet way, extraordinary. Evidence of food storage, meat and bone cached against the coming scarcity. Clothing constructed from animal hides, scraped clean and worked soft enough to wear against skin, sewn together with tools made from bone. Shelters built from the bones of mammoths, enormous curved ribs driven into the frozen ground and covered with layered skins to hold the warmth inside. These are not simple, reactive survival behaviors. They are complex, multi-step plans that required a group to look at the present moment and imagine a future state of the world, colder, darker, emptier, and then spend energy now preparing for a condition that had not yet arrived. That capacity, the ability to prepare for a future you can only imagine, is one of the most profound things our ancestors carried with them into every new environment they entered. The desert presented a different set of demands entirely. In the expanding Sahara and the arid corridors of the Middle East, the threat was not cold, but thirst. Water was hidden, scarce, and deeply unreliable, buried in the root systems of specific desert plants, pooled in rock depressions that only filled during rare rains, carried invisibly through dry riverbeds that ran underground long after the surface had baked hard and cracked. Reading a desert landscape for hidden water is a skill of extraordinary precision and patience. You follow the animals that can sense moisture from distances no human nose can reach. You learn the specific plants whose roots go deep enough to find what the surface does not show. You remember with absolute fidelity the location of every source you have ever found, because forgetting could mean dying of thirst 3 days from the nearest alternative. Each of these adaptations, the sewn hide clothing, the cached food, the desert water knowledge, was earned through failure as much as through success. The groups that survived were the ones that could absorb a catastrophe, learn from it, and pass that learning forward before the same catastrophe returned. There is a profound solitude in this image, and it is worth sitting with quietly for a moment. Small groups of people, separated from other groups by hundreds of kilometers of hostile terrain, frozen steppe, shifting desert, dense and pathless forest, each one carrying a slightly different version of the accumulated knowledge of human survival. Each one adapted to a local world that no other human had ever had to understand in quite that specific way. A group in the cold north knowing things about ice and hide and stored food that a group on the arid plateau of the Middle East had no use for, and vice versa. The knowledge was becoming regional, specialized, local, shaped by the specific and lethal demands of each particular piece of the planet. And yet, despite those distances and those barriers, something else was happening too. Something that the archaeological record shows us in quiet, specific detail. Specific types of stone, materials that only occur naturally in one location, appear in sites hundreds of kilometers from their source. Ochre, that deep, red iron-rich pigment that early humans used for marking and decoration, moves through the record across vast distances and across many different groups. These materials did not travel by themselves. They moved because people moved, or because objects passed from one group to another, hand to hand across the distances between them. Trade, or something very much like it. Connection across separation, the slow, deliberate movement of valued things between groups that had every practical reason to remain entirely isolated from each other. The reason this matters is simple, and it is absolute. It tells us that even in the most hostile and isolating environments on Earth, even when the distances between groups were vast enough that most individuals would never in their lifetime encounter anyone from outside their own small band, humans were reaching toward each other, finding ways to connect across the cold and the dark and the dry and the distance. They were isolated, yes, profoundly, completely, and for most of their lives, isolated. But they were not entirely alone. Across the vast, indifferent distances of the ancient world, in the spaces between the ice and the desert and the deep forest, humans were finding each other and leaving. In the stone and the ochre, and the careful placement of traded objects in the earth, the quiet evidence that they had, the slow accumulation of us. Here is something we get wrong almost every time we talk about early humans. We describe them as primitive, as rough drafts, as the first fumbling attempts at something that would only become real and complete much later. But that is not what they were. They were not practice. They were not halfway to something else. They were fully formed people, living fully inside their world, with everything that implies grief and curiosity and social bonds and the particular, irreplaceable knowledge of the specific landscape they moved through every day. By around 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were doing things that we would recognize immediately as deeply, specifically human. At a site called Blombos Cave on the southern coast of South Africa, they were engraving geometric patterns onto pieces of ochre, careful, deliberate, abstract marks that had no survival function, no practical application, no caloric value. They were making beads from ostrich eggshell, piercing them, precisely, almost certainly, stringing them and wearing them. They were burying their dead with ochre and shells placed alongside the body. These are not the behaviors of a creature focused entirely on staying alive. These are the behaviors of a creature that has started asking what it all means. That shift from pure survival to something that reaches towards meaning is one of the most profound things in this entire story. And it happened far earlier than we used to think. And yet, here is the thing that stops you when you sit with the numbers honestly. For most of the period between 300,000 and 70,000 years ago, the entire human population of this planet was probably smaller than a modern mid-sized city, perhaps 10,000 individuals, perhaps fewer. The whole species, every person who had ever learned to tend a fire, every person who carried the accumulated ecological knowledge of their group, every person who had ever pressed a geometric mark into a piece of ochre. All of them together would not have filled a single city block in the world we live in now. And then, around 74,000 years ago, it got worse. A supervolcano on the island of Sumatra erupted with a force that sent ash across the sky and cooled the entire planet for years afterward. The Toba eruption. Some researchers believe it pushed the human population down to just a few thousand people. The debate about exactly how severe the bottleneck was is ongoing, and honest scientists hold it with some uncertainty. But even the more conservative estimates describe a species balanced on an edge so narrow that the entire future of the human story fit inside a group small enough to gather in a single room. A few thousand people. Sit with that for a moment, in the quiet dark. Every tool technique that had been refined across hundreds of thousands of years, every piece of knowledge about water sources and predator territories and seasonal migrations, every social bond, every remembered face, every story that had ever been told around a fire, all of it balanced on the survival of just a few thousand individuals in a world that had just been made colder and darker and harder by a catastrophe they had no framework to understand. And they survived. That is the thing. They survived, and from that narrow, precarious bottleneck, the human population slowly began to grow again, carrying forward, in their hands and their minds and their social bonds, everything that had been learned across the long, hard centuries before. The world they were moving through was beginning very slowly to fill with us. By around 50,000 years ago, humans had reached Australia. And this is worth pausing on, because reaching Australia was not the same as crossing a land bridge or following a herd across open steppe. Australia required crossing open ocean. Even during periods when sea levels were lower, there was no land route. Getting there required watercraft, rafts, at minimum, and probably something more deliberate than that. And it required the navigational knowledge to cross open water without a visible destination on the other side. Someone had to look at the horizon, see nothing, and go anyway. By 15,000 years ago, humans were in the Americas, the last of the major landmasses to be reached, at the far end of a journey that had begun in the Rift Valley millions of years before. Every one of these expansions was built on everything that had come before it: the stone tools, the fire, the reading of landscapes and weather and animal behavior, the social structures that kept knowledge alive across generations, the capacity, hard-won and deeply costly, to imagine a future state of the world and prepare for it in advance. None of these things were invented fresh in each new place. They were carried, they were inherited, they were the foundation that made each new step possible. And none of it was inevitable. That is the other thing to hold on to, quietly, in the dark. At every single point in this story, it could have ended. A drought at the wrong moment, a disease moving through a group already too small to absorb the loss, a volcanic winter that lasted one season too long. Any of these could have closed the story completely, and the planet would have continued on without us, the way it had continued on without us for billions of years before we arrived. But it didn't end. And the reason it didn't end is not one single thing, not one great invention, not one decisive moment of genius or courage or luck. It is the accumulation of 10,000 small decisions, 10,000 quiet adaptations, 10,000 moments of someone reading the grass correctly, or rationing the stored food carefully enough to last through the cold, or passing a skill to a younger pair of hands before the knowledge could be lost. That is what we are, when you follow the thread all the way back, not the product of a single leap forward, the result of an unbroken chain of small, ordinary, desperate, and quietly extraordinary acts of survival, stretching all the way back to the very first upright step on the open ground of the Rift Valley. The step that never ended. The step never stopped, That is the quiet truth at the center of everything we have moved through tonight. Every fire tended, every stone shaped, every dark night survived. It was all one continuous movement forward. From that first upright posture on the African grassland to every human being alive on Earth, right now, listening to this. And you carry all of it with you. The fear of the dark, the pull toward other people, the restless need to know what is beyond the next horizon. None of it has left us. It has only been given new shapes in a world those first humans could never have imagined. If you find yourself drawn to these quiet journeys through deep time, consider subscribing. There are more of these waiting for you, each one a different door into the long, slow, extraordinary story of where we came from and what we are. Good night for now.